welcome. The Wood Library wants to bring you something very special today. We're going to be talking with Dr. Alan Van Posnack, a very, very distinguished anesthesiologist. And it's going to be informal. We're going to be focusing predominantly on his syringe slide whistle. My name is Kathryn McGoldrick, and Alan and I go back a long time, and I'll explain that to you shortly. But today is Saturday, June 1st, and we're at the home of Dr. Van Posnack here in Tenafly, New Jersey. I mentioned Alan and I go back a long time. Alan is the reason I went into anesthesia. He taught me anesthesia when I was a medical student at Cornell University Medical College, now Weill. Alan was a wonderful mentor. He took me under his wing, and as I said, he's the reason I went into anesthesia. He has had an incredibly distinguished career. He spent his whole life at Cornell as professor of anesthesiology and pharmacology, was a beloved professor and clinician, and it's just such a pleasure to speak with him today. I should also point out that 21 years ago, I interviewed Alan for the Living History series that the Wood Library produces, and that was much more formal. Today we're being informal, and Alan has on a shirt that has a Bouvier de Flanders on it, and you'll also see in the background some pictures of Alan's Bouviers. And when I was a medical student, Alan very generously gave me a Bouvier de Flanders. Marvelous, marvelous dogs. But living in Manhattan in a medical student dormitory, the Bouvier did not fit. But I go back now to that Living History interview, which was 21 years ago. And I was thinking about it as I was driving down. And I realized, it's sort of a little bit of symmetry here, that when I introduced Alan then, or interviewed Alan then, he was about the same age that I am now. I think maybe he was even a little younger, because I'm going to be 73 this summer, and Alan is now 91. But it's kind of fun flipping the ages now, and I get to sit where Alan did 21 years ago. So Alan, we want to talk about your syringe slide whistle today, and why don't you start with how you got interested in it, and just tell us whatever you want to tell us about syringe slide whistles.
Oh, thank you, Kathy. What a treat to be with you again. And here we are, still part of the living history. I hope we can continue to be part of the living history for quite a while yet. I will talk about the whistle and how it developed, but I would like to say thank you to several people. I want to thank Melissa for coming here and doing all this wonderful camera work. I thank her husband, Joe, who has set up the audio equipment and the video equipment as well. And I want to thank Dr. McGoldrick for being here. And I want to thank Steve Jackson, because Steve is the one who got us all together and who wanted the story of the syringe whistles. So thank you to all of you, and here we go. Now, when I was young, from my earliest days, I remember my Irish nurse taking me to church with her and loving the sound of the pipe organ in the church. That has been with me all these years, never changed, only grows greater and greater. When I was about 15 years old, I got a job working with a pipe organ builder, a fellow named Arpad Fazekas, a fellow from Boston, classically trained in the Boston Latin School, and knowledgeable in many of the things you need to know to build a pipe organ. Metal work, carpentry, woodwork, key making, electricity, magnetism, pneumatics, electric motors, blowers, many, many things you need to know, and he knew them all. He had been the shop foreman for Hook Hastings and Company, and gone out on his own afterwards. His son seemed to have inherited much of his father's many talents, and his son became the maker of the radio-controlled puppets for the Jim Henson Muppet Show. So that it was a quite talented family that I was taken into. He paid me all the $15 a week, and he told me, if you love pipe organs, that's great, but don't expect to make any money doing this. Eventually, I went on from pipe organ maintenance to medical school, and I began to see sort of pipe organs parts, the organ pipes in things like syringes, and I began to make syringe whistles. How to make a whistle, I really didn't know to begin with, but I knew how an organ pipe was shaped, and I knew there was a wind channel which impinged on the upper lip of the pipe. And so I began carving syringes, trying to make them look like organ pipes, and eventually I got a partially successful one. I refined it and kept working at it until I could take a 10cc syringe and make it into a whistle that would sound almost 2 octaves in range. That was very useful. Other people became interested in it, and I began making syringe whistles for medical students and residents, and it became kind of a popular item. Okay, let's see which one is the best. They do vary quite a bit. Let's see if this is a good one. Thank you, Melissa. That's perfect. When I would lecture in pharmacology, I would prepare one of these whistles for each member of the class, and that was 100 whistles. It took me all day to make one. But when we would get to the end of the lecture, to the Cornell medical students, and since I was a Cornellian myself, both from Ithaca and New York, and my father had been a Cornellian, the Cornell alma mater was very much in my mind, so we would do, let me see if I can find the right note. Yeah, that's the note for the alma mater. Here we go. Thank you, thank you.
You were on Conan O'Brien show, right?
Oh,
yes.
oh.
Tell us about that, how that came about, and what it was like being on national television.
Oh, okay. Now, I would play these for the kids in the hospital. I played them for the medical students. When I went to pediatrics to see a child operatively, pre-anesthetically, I would always have one of these with me. And I would give it to the child, play happy birthday to you, and give it to them. And it would help, I hoped, to take some of the fearsomeness out of being in the hospital. And once they were assured that this was not a dreaded shot, and it was a musical instrument, they would have fun playing it, almost interminably. The parents would think it was fun for about 5 minutes, and most of the floor nurses were ready to kill me for disturbing the peace and quiet of the floor. Now, there was, from the Big Apple Circus, there was what was called the Clown Care Unit. And the clowns would come and do various tricks and entertain the children. They saw me one day with this syringe whistle and asked me how they were made. And I taught the clowns how to make these. Eventually, the head of the Clown Care Unit, Michael Christensen, met with me and learned how to make syringe whistles. And he went to a convention in Europe. I think it was a convention in Germany, and he taught the European clowns how to make syringe whistles too. Michael Christensen was a great teacher and a very kindly man who was determined to make the hospital experience as pleasant as it possibly could be. I got a call later on from the television program, and they said, Mandy Patinkin, whom you met at a party for the Big Apple Circus, Mandy Patinkin is going to be on the Conan O'Brien show, and he wants you to be there too. Will you do it? So I said, okay, and I have to confess that I did not know who Conan O'Brien was at that time. And I went, and I'm sure I made such a fool of myself. My wife still dreads my mentioning that adventure, but it worked out very well. And Mandy Patinkin had the ability to make a sound of a horse trotting, which I can't. And he asked me to do the William Tell overture with him so he could be the Lone Ranger galloping away on the horse Silver. Well, I flubbed it on the first couple of tries, but we did get through, and then Conan O'Brien took a syringe whistle, injected it into his neck, and ended the session. So we've had a lot of fun with these things. As it says in the syringe whistle article which I wrote, these serve more than just an entertainment purpose. They should teach us respect for the principles of physics, Bernoulli, and the various physical principles that underlie the practice of our profession, enabling us to provide safer and better care for our patients. So if they help a little bit in that way, I'm grateful for that. And as it says at the end of the 150th Psalm, it says there's a verse which is particularly appropriate for anesthesiologists. It says, "Let everything that hath breath praise the Lord."
As you were speaking, I was thinking you had quite a reputation at Cornell when I was a student as a gadgeteer. I mean, you were very creative and innovative, and it seemed like you were always devising something or designing something. Would you take a few minutes to tell us about some of the things that you put together that made life in the OR smoother?
In the beginning, when I practiced anesthesia, I did pretty much everything because we didn't have much in the way of subspecialization. With the passage of time, anesthesiologists tended to subspecialize. There were obstetrical anesthesiologists, there were neurosurgical anesthesiologists, there were cardiac anesthesiologists, there were specialists, there were pediatric and neonatal anesthesiologists, and eventually I began to do more and more neurosurgical anesthesia. And the reason I did was because I was at that time the newest member of the department, and I was given the job that was least desirable. Nobody liked to do neurosurgical anesthesia because the chief of neurosurgery, Dr. Bronson Ray, who had been resident in neurosurgery under Harvey Cushing, Bronson Ray was a man, to put it mildly, who was ferocious. He would direct the headlight that he wore into your eyes, tell you exactly what he wanted, and tolerate no deviation whatsoever. Nobody liked to work with him. He was not only an excellent neurosurgeon, he was a fine musician, he was a good enough cellist that he was a member of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra when he was still in medical school. He was a capable artist who drew wildflowers very well. He was a carpenter, a wood carver, a hunter, a fisherman, a remarkable person. I was put in his operating room because nobody else wanted to be there, and I discovered very quickly that while this man was extremely demanding, he always demanded exactly the same thing. So once you knew what he wanted, he was the easiest guy in the world to
Very
work
predictable.
with. Yeah, he was very predictable. And he would come into the operating room smoking a cigar, and he would put out the cigar, and then he would put it on the tray of my anesthesia machine. And I would look at him and I would say, "Sir, is that a conductive cigar?" and we had these little games that we used to play. Now, one of the things you have to be very careful in neurosurgical anesthesia is that the endotracheal tube remain in place, because the head is draped, and if the tube comes out, it can be a disaster before it's properly replaced. The adapter that we used from the anesthesia machine to the endotracheal tube was fairly heavy and was put together in this fashion. I changed it, and I sealed this end, and then I took off this pop-off valve, and I put a fitting for an endotracheal tube inside there, so that it was then possible to mount this very close to the face, and its chance of becoming dislodged was far, far less. So this adapter was made by the Forager Company and distributed rather widely. And at the end of each year, I had a whole bunch of these made, and each graduating resident got one of these to take with him or herself on the rest of their career. So this was in the Forager catalog for quite a while, but this kind of equipment is gone now because we use disposable equipment, and if you look closely, you'll see that the endotracheal end of the disposable equipment is fashioned pretty much the way I used to make them.
A very interesting story, and we've talked a lot tangentially about history. That's come up a lot in this discussion. And you mentioned earlier when we were setting up all our high-tech equipment for this filming that Dr. Gravenstein had asked you to write an article on the whistle. And do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. We had, as most departments do, we had a visiting professor program. And as part of the visiting professorship, I would give one of these syringe whistles to the visiting professor. When Dr. Gravenstein came up from the University of Florida at Gainesville, he delivered a magnificent lecture on the history of anesthesia departments, the history of Gainesville in particular, and especially he said, I can't talk about the history of departments unless I talk about the history of hospitals too. And he spoke about hospitals, how in the old days, in BC days, there were no hospitals. And if somebody got sick, he stayed at home and died at home. But if someone was a traveler, what does a traveler do who becomes sick? There's no one to care for him. And so in ancient Greece, the xenodokia, xeno from stranger and dokia to take care of, the xenodokia were held in the temples, particularly the temple of Aesculapius, that poor unfortunate son of Apollo, who was killed because he had the secret of making people live forever. So that xenodokia were formed and they became the first hospitals. In Roman Empire times, the Roman armies had old soldiers who were no longer able to fight, and they were put in homes called valetudinaria. And those eventually became what we call our Veterans Administration hospitals. So between the xenodokia and valetudinaria, we had the beginnings of hospitals in which there were three elements. There was a scientific element, very primitive at first. There was a social element, because the poor and the sick needed care. And there was a religious element, because we all exist because of the good grace of a power stronger than ourselves. So between those three things, Dr. Gravenstein presented a brilliant and a moving lecture with wonderful illustrations. And I went to him afterwards and I said, those are such great illustrations. And he said, I'm glad you like them. My daughter drew them. So there they were, and I gave him one of these syringe whistles. And he said, what is this? And I showed him what it was. I played it for him. And he said, you must write an article for my journal. And I thought he was kidding. And I said, oh yeah, sure, fine. And then he went back to Gainesville, and a couple of weeks later, I got a letter. Thank you for agreeing to write an article for the journal of which I am editor. In your article, I would like you to cover the following points. Bing, 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 bing. I thought, how did I get into this? And I began, after thinking about it for a while, I began to write. And once I started writing, I couldn't stop. It went on and on and on. And I showed it to my wife, who was trained as an English teacher, and to my daughter, the physician. And they took this all apart, got rid of most of the junk, and gave it back to me That's a pretty good article, and I sent it on to Dr. Gravenstein, and it's been published in the Journal of Clinical Monitoring. So that's the story behind that article.
Well, Alan, this has been just so interesting and so much fun. And I've been thinking as we were talking, you know, you've lived 91 years and you've seen a lot and you've seen a lot of change. And it might be interesting for our listeners to ask you what changes do you think were really positive, and then maybe a change or two that was negative.
That's a very good and challenging question. You know, I have one of my residents from 40 years ago, Larry Rabinowitz, whom I see at a Korean gym that I go to. And Larry has said to me repeatedly, "You had the best. Ever since you retired, things have been going downhill." Now, some of the good things, I think, the increasing specialization in anesthesia, because no one can know it all. I was a reasonably competent anesthesiologist in the general sense, but if you gave me a 2-pound premature to anesthetize, I wouldn't know how to do it, and I certainly would not be safe for that child. So pediatric and neonatal anesthesia developed during my time, and that's good. Obstetrical anesthesia, multiple births. A woman is pregnant with 6 babies. How do you manage the anesthesia for that? It takes a specialist, a super specialist, a team of specialists to do that. Compared to that, neurosurgery was relatively simple. And any idiot could do it, and this idiot did it very happily for some 30 years. There were other things where transplant surgery, for example, if you want to do a lung or a heart or a liver or a kidney transplant, they all bring special problems, and you need specialists to handle that properly. So there has been a development of specialization and a development of board certification in these specialties, which I think is definitely good. So from the professional side, I see a lot of good things happening. From the social and the financial side, I'm less sanguine, should I say. I think more poor people have access to better and more care than did when I started out. We had a rather sharp division between what we called pavilion patients, who were the ward patients, and the semi-private patients, who were a little better off, and then the private patients up in the tower, and they were the best off of all. I think insurance programs have tended to level that somewhat, and poor people now have better access to good care, and that's good. On the money side of it, I don't know what to say, because there has been, and Dr. Gravenstein pointed this out 25 years ago in his lecture, he said there has been an increase in the number of non-medical managers telling doctors what they can and cannot do for the purpose of making the hospital a for-profit organization. And Dr. Gravenstein concluded, I think, in a very gracious way. He said, whether or not this is good or bad is for the future to determine. So 25 years ago, he saw it coming, and here we are.
Prescient.
And now you are working, Kathy, you are working, trying to make all this make sense. And I thank you for it.
Thank you.
You are the greatest.
No, you are.
Thank you.
And now Dr. Van Posnak is going to show us how one constructs a syringe slide whistle.
Here is a completed syringe whistle. Let me show you how it sounds, and then I will try and show you how one is made. It takes 2 syringes to make one whistle. First, we need to make a block to put at the very bottom. Notice this second plunger that's at the bottom of this whistle. We take the plunger and we separate it with a razor blade. There we are. There's the wind block, which will go at the bottom of the syringe. Now we have to make a wind channel by shaving off the side of the plunger. So we take the razor blade and shave off just this little piece of rubber. See that? Now we take the syringe body and we're going to make the opening, the embouchure. And I know from experience, for it to come out right, we need to make a cut at 1.4. Notice that I rock back and forth carefully. I don't saw, and I'm delicate the way I do it, because if this blade flies in the wrong direction, I'm going to get a very nasty cut. And I've done that too in the past. Now we try and come up from below. And there we are. We have just made an opening. And now let's take the wind block and push it down to the bottom of the syringe. It's important that that flat side of the wind block be exactly centered on the mouth. So I use this needle to move over, and now you can see that the wind block is properly centered. If I've done things just right, this might sound when I blow in it. Let's see if it works. And if it's anybody's birthday, there we are. That's how to do it.